This is the Climate Report on WFMP Louisville. I'm Hart Hagen, your host. This is episode 8. Now, on the Climate Report, we address the issue of what will it take to survive and thrive in a world faced with climate change? How can we together solve this problem? So we'll talk about that in just a minute, but first, WFMP is listener-supported radio. We are not beholden to corporate interests. We can say what we want. We don't have to worry about who we offend, at least in the corporate world. And that's very important because mainstream radio, mainstream TV, mainstream newspapers, they have these corporate sponsors, and they can't properly investigate them or even give reasonable opinions about what the corporations are up to. And since the corporations run the vast majority of our economy, it really silences what people can say. We are listener-supported radio, and if you would like to support us, please go to forwardradio.org and click on Donate. So our topic is, how do we create a world in which human beings can survive and thrive? And the short answer to that is that we're going to have to rethink just about everything. So on this show, we're going to talk about what we need to rethink. So in no particular order, let's get started. Now, we will have to rethink everything, but that can be fun. Just because things change does not mean we should fear that change. So we will have to rethink things like, we will have to rethink something called free trade. We've heard a lot about, President Trump and NAFTA, and it's too bad that most Americans are kind of clueless about what goes on with free trade. If you're clueless, it's not your fault. It's because you've been disengaged as a voter, and people, the ruling elite, wants you to be disengaged. People that have power without democracy don't want you to participate in democracy. So it's not your fault if you don't know very much about NAFTA or free trade, but we're going to fix that on this show. We need to rethink democracy. We need to rethink free markets. We need to rethink things like war and so-called defense. We have to rethink all of these things in order to be able to have a fighting chance of saving the planet. And as you know, the planet is in kind of serious trouble. I don't need to tell you that. Now, in no particular order, let's talk about some things that we need to rethink. One thing that we need to rethink is healthcare. And you might say, Hart, healthcare, what in the world does healthcare have to do with climate change? And here is what I'll say about that. Whenever you talk about solutions to climate change, you get into things like changing our transportation system or converting to solar energy. And the naysayers are saying, we can't afford this. Oh no, it costs too much. So let's look at some ways in which we can save money, including health care. Now, I don't have to tell you that in the United States of America, we pay twice as much as other industrialized countries do on health care. We are the only major industrialized country that does not have national health care, and that's why we pay twice as much as anybody else for health care. We pay approximately 18% of our gross domestic product on health care, whereas Switzerland is next in line. They pay maybe 14%. Most countries pay 9-10% or less of their gross domestic product on health care. And if we could switch to a national health care system, we would save so much money. So how would that work? Well, for example, let's look at pharmaceuticals. When we pay pharmaceuticals our government doesn't have the right to bargain with the pharmaceutical companies. Pharmaceutical companies are for profit, so we pay so much more than other countries do on pharmaceuticals. Because pharmaceutical companies are really in charge. They pay more than any other group on lobbying expenses, and all this is in the hundreds of millions just on lobbying expenses, not counting the commercials that they put on cable news and so we pay a lot in pharmaceutical costs alone because we have a for-profit healthcare system. That needs to change. If we're going to save the planet, we need to rethink healthcare so that we'll not only have a better healthcare system, but so that we will save money that we can put toward solutions like renewable energy, solutions like mass transit, things that will help us convert to an economy and an infrastructure in which we can actually save the planet. Next item. If we're going to save the planet, we need to look at all the money that we spend on so-called defense. Now, in a year's time, our federal budget shows that we pay approximately $600 billion on defense. And that does not count a couple other important items. It does not count Veterans Affairs. It does not count nuclear energy, not only nuclear energy, but nuclear weapons, which are part of the Department of Energy. So all told, we spend upwards of $1 trillion a year on so-called defense. And the problem with that is that it's not defense, it's aggression. The United States military goes all around the world beating up on defenseless countries that can't defend themselves, and lots of money goes into that, and it actually has the effect of making us more insecure, not more secure. When politicians talk about national security, they are really talking about national insecurity. So we need to convert to a system that actually takes care of our national security instead of making us more insecure. As part of that, we need to rethink nuclear weapons. Now, there was a time, maybe, conceivably, possibly, but not really, but maybe there was a time, say back in the 1950s or 60s or 70s, where we might have possibly, conceivably needed nuclear weapons. Those days are over. The United States is unchallenged and unequaled in our military power. Why do we need nuclear weapons? Is it to make us more secure? Don't think so. Nuclear weapons serve to make us insecure. I want you to do this little thought experiment with me. Imagine, if you will, if no one else in the world had nuclear weapons. And imagine if the United States somehow, for some reason, wanted to take out all the major cities in Russia with our nuclear weapons. And so in this little nuclear exchange, none of the American cities get taken out. Does America survive in that scenario? I don't think so, because there's something called a nuclear winter. These are hypothetical scenarios, but there's a reasonable argument that can be made that the United States does not survive, and no country in the world survives a nuclear war, even if it's totally one-sided. So nobody survives a nuclear war, and yet, And yet, President Obama, a Democrat, put in place an upgrade of our nuclear weapons so that we can have 3 times the capacity that we do now. Let me ask you, is that for the people of the United States? Or is that for a few rich people who get richer from building nuclear weapons? I think you know the answer to that. Nuclear weapons are not for anybody but a very short-sighted, arguably insane group of elites. We need to eliminate nuclear weapons. Let me repeat. We need to eliminate nuclear weapons. They do not serve a valid purpose if they ever did. They do not make us more secure. They make us more insecure. Why do we still have nuclear weapons? Next, so what else do we need to rethink in order to have a world in which we can survive and thrive in the face of climate change? One thing, we need to rethink class. Yes, class. Now here's how that works. There has always been a class war, but the powers that be do not want you and me to think that there is a class war. They don't want you to think about that. Even though there are so many ways in which the class war continues to go on. The assault on labor, the assault on the poor, the assault on the middle class. Think about this. Wages have been flat. In real terms, wages and salaries have been flat since 1970. Investment income keeps going up, but income from wages and salaries continues to be flat. Is that fair? Is that just? Is that equitable? I think you'll agree with me that that is not equitable. So we need to rethink class. And look at it this way. The very wealthy, the ruling elite, want to divide and conquer. They want to keep black people from, they want to keep, white people suspicious of black people, white and black people suspicious of Hispanics. They want to keep Americans suspicious of Arabs. They want to have us looking down our noses at immigrants. We need to rethink class because we are in this together. The poor and the middle class are in this together, and the wealthy do not have our best interests in mind. There are so many ways in which that is true. We'll get into the details in future episodes. Next item, we need to rethink the two-party system. So we've got Republicans and Democrats, and they're just about the same, aren't they? I mean, you can vote for Trump, who is a war hawk, or you can vote for Hillary, who is a war hawk. That's not very much of a choice, is it? You can vote for Trump, who is in the pocket of the big banks, or you can vote for Hillary, who is in the pocket of the big banks. That is not very much of a choice, is it? I think you'll agree with me that it is not. You can vote for Trump, who I would say hates the middle class and the poor, or you can vote for Hillary, who hates the middle class and the poor. You can vote for Trump, who says he's going to do something about NAFTA, but he's really not. He's just clowning around. You can vote for Hillary, whose husband brought us NAFTA, which was always opposed by the middle. It was opposed by workers in America. It was opposed by workers in Mexico. It was opposed by workers in Canada. And yet we got NAFTA anyway. So the two-party system gives us very little choice. We need competition and we need a third party, but more importantly, we need a cultural movement. We need to be organized. So how do you get organized? We need to rethink how we spend our spare time. We need to spend some of our spare time with, meeting with people in political oriented meetings. Come to me or to a meeting of Jewish Voice for Peace. Come to me with a meeting. Come with me to a meeting of Wild Ones Native Plants group. Come to me with to a meeting of the Sierra Club. We need to rethink how we get our entertainment, how we get our social needs met, and some of that needs to be in local organizing, local political organizing, so that we can get to know each other, so that we can band together, so that we can have an impact on our political system. So if you're just joining us, this is the Climate Report. And on the Climate Report, we ask and answer the question, what does it take for us to create a world in which we can survive and thrive in the face of climate change? So we know that climate change has something to do with CO2 emissions. We know that climate change has something to do with the emission of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and we need to do something about that. But here's what we don't want to do. We don't want to take this burden all on ourselves as individuals. It's not just about individual change, it's about systemic change. It's not about feeling guilty and feeling all alone and feeling, oh, I drive too much and oh, I don't buy enough at the farmer's market. It's great to limit your driving and limit your energy uses. And it's great to buy local foods and patronize local businesses, but we need to go for systemic change, not just individual change. So, one of the things that we need to rethink if we're going to tackle the problem of climate change is we need to rethink United States history. And it's like, Hart, why are you talking about United States history? I thought we were talking about climate change. I thought we were talking about the future. And you may have heard the saying that the trouble with not studying history is that if you don't study history, it'll repeat itself. And one of the ways in which we need to make sure that history does not repeat itself is to continue to get into war after war after war, because we fail to understand the reasons we've gone to war in the past, and that's a problem. So when President Bush got us into the Iraq War, that was just a repeat. It was a big, fat, huge lie. It was a pack of lies, but it's not the first time the American public has been told a pack of lies about a war. So let's go through some of these wars we've gotten into in the past. So let's talk about the Mexican-American War. So in the Mexican-American War, President James K. Polk said, Americans were attacked on American soil. Now this was about around 1848, and President Lincoln, who was not president yet, he was a United States congressman, he said, President Polk, tell me where. I want you to tell me the spot on which Americans were attacked. And nobody could ever tell Congressman Lincoln where Americans had been attacked on American soil. And so that's why he lost his bid to be a congressman next time, because, you don't oppose the president during wartime. You should never have the temerity or the courage or the audacity to question a president during wartime. So that's kind of the psychology. That's how Americans are. That's how most people are. But we got into the Mexican-American War because of a big, fat, huge lie. We got into the Spanish-American War because of a big, huge, fat lie. We were going to free Cuba. But we didn't want to free Cuba. We wanted to dominate Cuba. We were going to free the Filipinos, but we didn't want to free the Filipinos. We wanted to dominate the Filipinos. World War I, we were told a pack of lies about why we got into that war. We were told that an unarmed passenger ship called the Lusitania was sunk by the evil Germans with a sub. Well, the Lusitania was armed. It just didn't see the U-boat that was going to sink it. So it was a tragic event, but we got into it under false pretenses. You know the real reason we got into World War I? The real reason we got into World War I because, well, the Germans were fighting the Russians, but they were also fighting the British. And when the Russians fell, the British, the Germans all of a sudden had all these armies that they could take back to France and England. And the American financiers, such as J.P. Morgan, were saying, oh no, I lent money to the British. I don't want the British to lose because I'm going to lose my money. So the financiers got involved, and Woodrow Wilson got involved, and lots of propagandists got involved, like a guy named Edward Bernays, who was the nephew of Sigmund Freud, and he got involved, and it was the first big, huge propaganda deal. But the point is that we got into World War I because of a pack of lies. So I could go on, but we got into Iraq because of a pack of lies. Oh, there's all these weapons of mass destruction. Well, if there are weapons of mass destruction, we have a way of dealing with that. We have something called the United Nations. We have treaties that govern when and under what circumstances, how to deal with weapons of mass destruction. We have inspection teams of scientists associated with the United Nations. We're supposed to pursue means of peaceful resolution first. Was any of that done? You bet it was not done. So one thing about it is okay, so we're rethinking things. So we're rethinking the reasons we get into war. We're rethinking the lies that get told us because we're supposed to rush to our nation's aid whenever they send us and our young people into harm's way, into a war. But we just typically we get told a pack of lies every time it comes time to get into a war. There have been, I can think of one war, well, I mean, there have been a couple of wars in our history in which we arguably were fighting self-defense, but otherwise we have been induced and conned into fighting wars of aggression. Wars of aggression are actually illegal. So, one thing we need to do in order to figure out how we can survive and thrive in a world that with climate change is to rethink the reasons we get into war and stop getting into wars that are unjust and in fact illegal. So if you're just joining us, this is the Climate Report. I'm Hart Hagen, and the purpose of this show is to ask and answer the question, what will it take to solve the problem of climate change? In other words, what will it take for us to create a world in which we can survive and thrive? Because it's not a given that we will survive this thing. We are not entitled to survival, especially when we indiscriminately pollute and trash the planet and ignore all the warning signs that says we are warming the planet. So let's look at some of the things that we need to rethink in order to have a decent chance of survival and a decent chance of, beyond survival, thriving. So one thing we need to do is we need to rethink capitalism. So capitalism, isn't that like American as apple pie? Well, that's what they want you to think. That's what business interests want you to think. But the problem with talking about capitalism, and the reason there's so much hypocrisy related to capitalism, is that those who give lip service to capitalism often don't practice what they preach. Can we talk about banks? Can we talk about the big banks who preach all this stuff about the free market and capitalism, but when they take a risk and when it doesn't work out for them, they come crawling to the government wanting a handout. So what they want is not an actual free market. They want a free market for you and me, but they want a world of socialism for them. They want socialism for the wealthy, and they want the brutality of a free market for the poor and the middle class. They want the poor and the middle class to be exposed to risk, but they want the wealthy to be protected from risk. So we need to rethink capitalism. Now, can we also talk about oil companies? Can we talk about oil companies? Can we talk about how the oil companies are subsidized with your tax dollars and mine? Can we talk about how oil companies are subsidized to the tune of $700 billion annually? Those are explicit subsidies, but let's talk about implicit subsidies. Can we talk about the Pentagon budget? Can we talk about how when we go all around the world beating up on every little defenseless country, is that not a subsidy to the oil industry? When we go to Iraq, why did we go to Iraq? Well, we went to Iraq because they had weapons of mass destruction, right? Wrong. They did not have weapons of mass destruction. George Bush knew it. Dick Cheney knew it. Colin Powell knew it. They did not have weapons of mass destruction, but what we did need was their oil. They did have oil, and we needed their oil. And so we roll into a country and pummel it into the dust. And then a few years later, as soon as we know we can get away with it, we make them sign a contract that says you're supposed to allow foreign investment, and the terms of that contract for foreign investment provide that we will be able to take all of the oil profits out of the country if we want to. So all of that, so what we've been describing here is a scenario whereby your tax dollars and mine go into the wallets and the bank accounts of the oil companies and their shareholders. The Pentagon budget serves to subsidize the profits of the oil companies. Can we talk for a minute? Okay, so we're rethinking capitalism. Can we talk for a minute about pharmaceutical companies? Can we talk about how your tax dollars and mine go to research and development for drugs, and then as soon as the research and development is ready, as soon as the drugs are ready to go to market, we give the rights to those drugs to the pharmaceutical companies, who then use our research and development dollars, our taxpayer dollars, our government dollars. They use that to sell drugs for which they have an exclusive patent. It's a monopoly. A patent is a monopoly. The pharmaceutical companies take your research money, your research and development, your tax dollars for their research and development, and then they use it to make a profit. That does not seem to me to be capitalism, because you and I are the ones who took a risk with that money, but they're the ones that get to keep the profits. That hardly seems like real capitalism to me. So be careful when you don't believe what you hear with these companies practicing preaching the capitalism that they do not, in fact, practice themselves. They're hypocrites. They want you and me to be subject to the rigors and the risks of the capitalist free market, but they do not want the capitalist free market for themselves. Can we please rethink capitalism? Because there's a huge disconnect between the rhetoric and the reality. Another problem with capitalism, such as it is that it always puts profits before people. So, let's take the fossil fuel industry. Can we talk about fracking? Fracking is hydraulic fracturing. You pump a bunch of water into the ground, and then you make it explode, and then from that you get natural gas, and it causes water pollution, it causes air pollution, it causes earthquakes, it even can cause, fire. Some people around fracking sites, they turn on their water faucet and they can light they can light what comes out, because gas is coming out of their water faucets, because gas is getting mixed in with the water because of all the fracking that's going on. So this is capitalism. This is unregulated, unfettered capitalism, and the problem with it is that who bears the cost of that? Is that company that is making the profit off of that fracked natural gas also going to bear the cost of the dirty water, the dirty air, the earthquakes, the exposure to toxic substances that cause cancer and other maladies? No, they're not going to pay for any of that, because we believe in unfettered, unregulated capitalism. It is a fraud and it is a mockery. That's about all we have time for today. Thank you so much for joining me. Don't forget to go to forwardradio.org and click on donate. Please support listener-supported radio. And that's all we have time for. This has been episode 8. Join us next time when we will talk more about how we need to rethink nearly everything, but this can be fun. Thanks so much. Goodbye.